The other Allied commanders thought he was either lying or had lost his mind. The Germans were laughing too. Hitler's surprise attack had just ripped a vast hole through Allied positions in the Ardennes, creating what the press would soon call the Bulge. Wehrmacht commanders were convinced they had accomplished the impossible. Total strategic surprise against the overconfident Americans. They believed their winter offensive would sever the Allied armies and force a peace treaty. After all, who could possibly halt 3 German armies comprised of 250,000 troops and 1,000 tanks surging through frozen woods toward Antwerp? But the Germans didn't know about George Patton. And they certainly didn't expect that in the coldest winter in recent memory, with temperatures plunging below freezing, this American general would not only halt their charge, but turn their ambitious offensive into their ultimate disaster on the Western Front. This is the account of how Patton's Third Army turned the snow crimson with enemy casualties and transformed Hitler's final gamble into America's most significant battlefield victory. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. was 59 years old when fate called him to the Ardennes. Born into a military lineage in 1885, Patton had dedicated his life to preparing for the moment when everything would depend on one man's capability to guide soldiers into the severity of modern war. By December 1944, he commanded the Third Army, consisting of over 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks, and had already cemented his fame as the most aggressive tank commander in the Allied forces. But December 16, 1904 altered everything. While Patton's Third Army was advancing through the SAR region, preparing for their own thrust into Germany's industrial core, Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. In the pre-dawn darkness, 29 German divisions slammed into the lightly defended American lines in the Ardennes forest. The German strategy was daring in its scope. Drive 60 miles through Belgium and Luxembourg, seize the crucial port of Antwerp, and split the British and American forces. What made the German assault so astonishing was not just its scale, but its timing. Allied intelligence had completely failed to spot the enormous concentration of German forces. The Wehrmacht had moved 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks into position, relying only on nighttime movements and strict radio silence. When the attack commenced, it achieved total tactical surprise. Within hours, German armored units were speeding westward, overwhelming American positions and triggering chaos in Allied command centers. The critical moment arrived on December 19th, when General Dwight Eisenhower convened an urgent conference at Verdun. The situation was dire. German forces had already pushed 20 kilometers into Belgium, imperiling strategic intersections and the vital town of Bastogne. The First Army was in chaos, with entire units fragmented or decimated. If the German drive continued at this velocity, they might actually reach Antwerp and secure their strategic goal. To grasp what transpired next, you must understand the individual who would determine the battle's result. George Patton had been training for this instant his entire military career. As a young officer, he had studied the great military leaders of history, Napoleon, Alexander, Caesar, and believed he was destined to command a great army in a desperate conflict. His early experiences in World War I, where he led the first American tank formations in combat, taught him the crucial strength of armored warfare and rapid offensive maneuvers. Yet, Patton's road to the Ardennes was challenging. His spectacular leadership in North Africa and Sicily had been marred by the infamous slapping incidents, where he physically assaulted 2 soldiers suffering from combat stress. This incident nearly ended his career and excluded him from the initial D-Day landings. However, his reputation for energetic leadership and strategic insight made him essential. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied general. So much so that he became the centerpiece of a complex deception effort that convinced the Wehrmacht he was planning to invade at Calais instead of Normandy. By the time the Third Army entered France in July 1944, Patton had learned to better manage his aggressive tendencies. His leadership method was unique among Allied commanders. While other generals directed their armies from secure command posts, Patton spent his days visiting frontline units, frequently riding in an open jeep through enemy fire. He recognized that soldiers needed to witness their commander sharing their peril and hardship. The Third Army's swift thrust across France had already showcased Patton's tactical brilliance. After breaking out of Normandy, his troops had advanced 600 miles in just 4 months, freeing thousands of square miles of land and capturing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. But the fall of 1944 brought frustration, supply shortages, and fierce German resistance in places like Metz had slowed his advance to a crawl. Many began to question if Patton was only a successful pursuit commander, effective when chasing a retreating foe, but less capable against determined opposition. The Battle of the Bulge would prove that analysis entirely wrong. What Patton exhibited in the winter of 1944 challenged conventional military wisdom, the idea of impossible logistics becoming achievable through superior leadership and foresight. When Eisenhower asked him how long it would take to turn his Third Army north to counterattack, Patton's response stunned everyone present. While other generals were still trying to comprehend the magnitude of the German offensive, Patton was already several steps ahead. Unknown to the other commanders at Verdun, Patton had already considered this scenario. His intelligence staff had noticed unusual German activity and had drafted 3 separate contingency plans for a northward turn. This was Patton's climax, his brilliance. He didn't just react to events, he anticipated them. While others were taken back by the German offensive, Patton saw it as a prime opportunity. The sheer scope of Patton's proposal defied traditional military theory. He was offering to pull 6 full divisions out of active combat, turn them 90 degrees, and march them over 100 miles through some of the worst winter weather in decades, all while keeping their combat readiness intact. Most military experts would have labeled this unfeasible. Moving an army while in contact with the enemy is one of the most challenging military maneuvers. Doing it in winter, over frozen roads, while maintaining secrecy seemed utterly impossible. But Patton understood something that manuals couldn't teach: the force of audacious action to turn desperate situations into decisive victories. His principle was simple: attack. Always attack. He believed the enemy was always weaker than they appeared, and that rapid aggressive action could overcome nearly any disadvantage. This was not thoughtless courage. It was calculated aggression based on thorough preparation and an intimate understanding of his enemy's limitations. The German strategy had a fundamental flaw that Patton instantly identified. Hitler's plan demanded precise timing and flawless execution. The German forces had limited fuel reserves, only enough for 6 days of operations, and relied on seizing Allied fuel depots to continue their advance. They needed to reach their objectives quickly before Allied air superiority could intervene and before American reinforcements could arrive. Any delay would guarantee the offensive's failure. Patton's solution was simple in concept, but immensely complicated in execution. Instead of attempting to stop the German offensive where it was strongest, he would attack where they were most exposed, at the base of the Bulge. His 3-division assault would not only relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, but also threaten to trap the entire German spearhead. On December 19th, Patton departed the Verdun Conference and immediately set his plan in motion. He contacted his headquarters and spoke just 2 words: play ball. This code phrase activated the pre-arranged operational directives his staff had prepared. Within hours, over 133,000 Third Army vehicles were beginning one of the most complicated military troop movements in history. The 4th Armored Division, the 81st Infantry Division, and the 26th Infantry Division started their march north, followed by support convoys transporting 62,000 tons of supplies. The conditions they faced were beyond brutal. This was the coldest winter in living memory across Europe. Temperatures hovered around 7 degrees C with snow that made visibility almost impossible. American troops lacked suitable winter attire. Many soldiers had only cotton field jackets and wool overcoats to shield them from the frigid conditions. Weapons seized up and required constant upkeep. Truck engines had to be started every half hour to prevent their oil from thickening. But Patton had prepared for this moment in ways that went beyond mere logistics. He understood that winter combat was as much a battle of morale as it was of supplies. While other commanders took cover in heated headquarters, Patton made it a point to be visible to his troops. He constantly traveled in an open jeep, his only concession to the icy temperatures being a heavy winter parka. His face often froze, but he persisted in his daily inspections, ensuring that the news of his presence spread through the ranks. The psychological effect was colossal. American soldiers fighting in conditions that would have challenged lesser units drew strength from knowing that old blood and guts was enduring their hardship. His words of praise and encouragement rapidly circulated through the Third Army's communication network. The old man says, "We're the finest soldiers in the world." Or Georgie says, "This is our finest hour." This was not just empty talk. Patton genuinely believed his soldiers were capable of the impossible, and his self-belief became theirs. The German response to Patton's maneuver highlights the true genius of his strategy. General Erich Brandenberger, commanding the German 7th Army facing Patton's sector, had expected a rapid reaction from the enemy. He was aware of Patton's reputation for aggressive armored warfare, and had even acknowledged that Patton conducted operations according to the fundamental German conception of mobile warfare. But even Brandenburger was astonished by the speed and precision of the Third Army's northward pivot. German commanders had not believed that any Allied force could perform such a complex maneuver under winter conditions. The Wehrmacht's own experiences in Russia had taught them how winter could completely stall even the most effective military machine. They assumed that American forces, with their reputation for reliance on comfort and logistics, would be even more susceptible to winter's effects. This miscalculation reveals a fundamental flaw in German strategic thought by late 1944. They continued to underestimate American military effectiveness, viewing U.S. forces as materially wealthy but deficient in fighting spirit and tactical skill. German General Gauss Blumentritt would later confess, "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive tank general of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander." But by December 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer the force that had conquered Europe in 1940. The divisions attacking in the Ardennes were a mix of elite formations and hastily assembled units filled with young boys and old men. Many German troops had not eaten in days and lacked adequate winter gear. Their vehicles ran on synthetic fuel that performed poorly in the cold, and their supply routes were already strained past the breaking point. The battle that ensued around Bastogne showcased the transformation of the American Army from the novice force that landed in North Africa in 1942 to a seasoned professional military. The 101st Airborne Division's defense of Bastogne became famous. But it was Patton's relief operation that transformed a defensive hold into an offensive triumph. When German commanders demanded Bastogne's surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," became an enduring symbol of American resolve. On December 22, 1944, in the midst of a massive snowstorm, Patton's three-division army attacked. The assault came as a total shock to German forces, who had assumed that winter conditions would prevent any major Allied counteroffensive. Along a 20-mile front, American tanks and infantry crashed into the German flank, pushing 7 miles into enemy positions on the first day. The combat was intense. American forces, driven by Patton's constant demands for aggressive action, refused to yield ground to German counterattacks. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading Patton's advance toward Bastogne, faced some of the finest remaining units in the German army. Tigers and Panthers, the Wehrmacht's most fearsome tanks, fought Shermans and tank destroyers across frozen fields that quickly became scenes of destruction. Patton had instructed his chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, to write a prayer for clear weather that would permit air support. The prayer distributed throughout the Third Army asked for divine intervention. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle." On December 23rd, the clouds lifted and Allied fighter bombers descended on German positions like avenging angels. The breakthrough occurred on December 26th, the day after Christmas. Elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Charles Bogus, broke through German defenses and linked up with the 101st Airborne in Bastogne. The narrow passage they opened was only 500 yards wide, but it shattered the German encirclement and paved the way for massive reinforcement of the American garrison. But Patton was not satisfied. While other commanders might have been content with relieving Bastogne, he saw the larger picture. The German offensive had dangerously overextended their forces, creating opportunities for devastating counterattacks. "Brad," he told General Bradley, "this time the Kraut stuck his head in the meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle." The systematic routing of German forces in the Ardennes took 6 weeks of savage winter combat. American and German soldiers fought in conditions that defy description. Foxholes dug out of frozen earth. Weapons that seized up from the cold. Men sharing body warmth to avoid freezing to death. The snow, initially untouched white, progressively turned red with the casualties of thousands of soldiers from both armies. By January 16, 1945, when American forces from north and south met at Hurled, the Bulge was eliminated. The German offensive, which Hitler had hoped would break the Allied unity and force a negotiated peace, had instead become a conclusion for the Wehrmacht. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men with over 700 tanks and 600 aircraft destroyed. Crucially, Germany had exhausted the last of its strategic reserves in a gamble that utterly failed. Patton's part in this triumph cannot be overstated. His capacity to reposition 6 full divisions in 72 hours while maintaining their combat effectiveness was one of the most extraordinary logistical feats in military history. As he later wrote to his wife, "Destiny sent for me in a hurry when things got tight. Perhaps God saved me for this effort." The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that George Patton was more than just an aggressive armored commander. He was a strategic genius who recognized that audacious action could transform dire circumstances into decisive victories. The Germans, who had scoffed at American military proficiency in December, were no longer laughing in January. They had learned at a terrible price that American soldiers, led by commanders like Patton, could fight and win under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Winston Churchill, never one to praise American achievements lightly, called the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. But for George Patton, it was something more. The vindication of a life dedicated to preparing for the moment when everything would depend on one man's ability to turn an impossible situation into an inevitable victory. The snow had indeed turned crimson, but it was German blood that stained the winter fields of the Ardennes, not American. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge unveiled a fundamental truth about warfare that Patton understood better than any other commander of his generation: that superior leadership, aggressive action, and absolute confidence in one's soldiers could overcome any tactical drawback. The Germans had launched their offensive believing that winter weather and American inexperience would guarantee their success. Instead, they discovered that George Patton's Third Army could fight anywhere, anytime, and against any enemy. The Ardennes became not Hitler's triumph, but his final defeat, and the moment when American forces achieved their finest hour in the crucible of winter warfare. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten battles, hidden histories, and untold soldier stories to life. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. What event or perspective would you like to see next? I read every comment.